I mean...
And we're live! Hey everybody, welcome to #SPSM, the Suicide Prevention Social Media Chat. I am very excited about tonight's program. We have a giant, whose shoulders upon which we stand, here with us at SPSM Chat tonight, and I'm really, really grateful to Bart and Tony and Stark, who really believed that this was the right program event to do, and who really brought this collaboration about. I'm at Doc Foreman. We're going to sort of do that sort of new switch that we've been doing. The Suicide Prevention Social Media Chat is a wonderful chat where we bring you expertise in the field of suicide and prevention at the intersection of technology and innovation. And you can find us and like us on Facebook. You can check out our videos on this YouTube channel. Please do. We have quite a few now. And you can also find us at spsmchat.com, or you can look at our Storify account for curations of what we've done in the past. But if you're interested in what we are doing tonight, and you should be, let me tell you, we have some wonderful guests. But first, I'm going to start with introducing our IT tech producer, Mr. Tony Wood.
Tony!
Howdy, everybody.
Tony,
Everybody on the Twitter stream, just tweet right at me if you have any questions for our guests at ADWWW, at ADWWW.
And Tony, who are you, really quickly?
I'm the computer guy. I'm the guy that turns the crank and keeps all of this nonsense running for your benefit, and I hope you enjoy it.
And you have a better microphone than all of us.
It's fancy.
And everyone, we have Dr. Bart Andrews. Dr. Bart Andrews, say hello.
Good evening, everybody. Really excited to be here. I'm kind of geeking out with Jerry Reed here. It's very, very cool. I'm really excited. So I am at Bart Andrews on Twitter. I work at the Amazing Behavioral Health Response in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm very excited about the show tonight. And for those folks who are asking about my hair, because I know you are, I have a new product. And are you ready for this? The new product I put in my hair this evening is water. Water. Turns out it's free. It comes out of this thing, and you put it. There's a tap.
You have to pay for the thing it comes out of.
Well, yeah, but it's free. I mean, it's really, when you think about it, water's really cheap. I mean, it's so cheap, it's almost free. So. And then that's my hair product update for the evening. And back to you, Doc Foreman.
Bart, really quickly, because I know that you and Tony really initiated this collaboration. Like this was one of those things where I get emails that are like, we have to do this. Can you tell us a little bit about the Midwest Suicide Prevention Conference and how this happened?
So that conference was just so amazing, and one of the coolest things was when Jerry got up and started talking about the history of the suicide prevention movement, and I think one of the things for somebody who's started out as a frontline crisis intervention clinician and was very divorced from the high end things and what was going on, the world's changed a lot in the last 17, 18 years in suicide prevention. When I started really getting into it was 1998. And hearing Jerry talk about what things were like, I mean, we complain. We all know, everybody who's on the SPSM chat group and who sees our tweets knows that we want to do more, we want to do better. But hearing Jerry talk about how things used to be and how much progress actually has been made, and to hear his stories, it was so cool. I mean, people's jaws were just dropping, and it was a really magical moment at that conference when Jerry was speaking. It was very, very cool.
And so, and speaking of magical moments, we're really, really grateful because the person who really helped us get all of this set up, and I introduce our next moderator, Stark. Tell us a little bit about who you are and how you made this happen.
Hi, SPSM chat. Great to see you again. I have been absent for the past few weeks due to other commitments. I work at the Suicide Prevention Resource Center with Jerry Reed. I'm a senior program associate, and I work on the #ZeroSuicide project, working to transform healthcare for people who are suicidal. When Jerry came back from the Midwest Suicide Prevention Conference, he stopped by my desk and said, "Hey, you know this guy? He's a tech guy. He asked me to do that SPSM chat you talk about." And I said, "Oh, cool." So I said, "Jerry, you know that's at 10 p.m. Eastern on a Sunday, right?" And he said, "Oh, I have to get up that late." I said, "Yes, Jerry, you do." And that is how we are here tonight.
We confused a really esteemed gentleman about time. We're very sneaky that way. So everybody, just very quickly, I'm really excited to introduce to you Jerry Reed, who is the director of the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. I'm going to let him introduce himself to you because the truth is he's just charismatic as hell. And I'm very excited for him to tell you a little bit about himself, what he does, and how he got here. Jerry, I'm turning it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great privilege to be with SPM's chat, and thank all you guys for inviting me and Sarah for convincing me it was absolutely the right thing for me to do. I will start by saying I am in bed every night by 9 o'clock. As I learned many years ago, which is part of my history, when I was a graduate student in aging administration, which is where I began as a social worker in aging, a young woman of 96 years of age, when she was being fed in the senior center, I said, Maria, what's the secret to a long life? And she said, Jerry, just go to bed the same day you get up. So think about that. It's a very wise piece of advice. But nonetheless, when Sarah said it'll be over by 11, I said I'll do it. So I'm delighted to be here. I am a social worker by training. Aging was my field of expertise. However, the day I got my graduate degree, I moved abroad and I served soldiers for 17 years, living overseas as a social worker, working on Army bases for many years, and then came back to the United States with my young family, 2 children and my wife, and shortly thereafter was an applicant for a congressional fellowship. And I applied to the Hill through the Defense Department, was selected, and you have to find your own boss when you're selected as a fellow. And I selected a guy by the name of Senator Harry Reid from the state of Nevada, and thankfully he selected me in return. So I started to work for Senator Reid. And
I'm just going to point out Harry and Jerry Reid. I would have done that simply because it's so Dr. Seuss, you can't stop yourself.
You know, your chances of selection are much greater when the guy has the same last name as you. So I did think that through, to be perfectly honest with you. And he was also on the aging committee, and I felt like I should kind of give back to the community that trained me as a social worker to be involved in the aging community. So it was like a no-brainer. It worked out. He selected me, and that's pretty much how I got to the suicide prevention field. And I've been here now for 20 years, and I guess the point that's relevant to the question is I was working for Senator Reid, and one day there was going to be a hearing on mental health in the elderly. And so as I called the state of Nevada and I said, what's the #1 mental health issue facing older adults in the state of Nevada? Without hesitation, the answer was suicide. So having heard that, I went and checked the CDC data, and sure enough, Nevada led the nation. So as a good staffer, I wrote up the talking points in the opening statement, and off to the hearing, Senator Reid and I go. And that day, Mike Wallace from 60 Minutes was a witness as well, and he shared his own story with clinical depression, and with the right help, he got well, and he was there to tell Congress this was the right conversation to be having, because mental health challenges are not a normal and necessary part of aging. They don't go hand in hand automatically. So if someone is struggling with a mental health issue, it's quite treatable. And as he shared his story, Senator Reid took the microphone and said, if you're brave enough to tell the American people about your battle with depression, then I want to tell the American people that many years ago, my pop shot himself. And he admitted for the first time publicly that he himself had lost his father many, many years earlier to suicide, and immediately said to the chairman, we should have a hearing on senior suicide, and this is an issue, considering it's the 11th leading cause of death, we ought to be actively discussing in the United States Congress. And I just happened to be very fortunate to be sitting behind him as a congressional fellow, and I was privileged enough to be able to help him look at the issue of suicide once it surfaced as a policy issue that warranted an examination. So that's how I got to the field of suicide prevention. And like almost immediately after he shared his loss, you just can't believe how many people called and said, it's really important that you do something. We'd like to meet with the senator, talk about suicide. So really the voice of the lost survivor just became incredibly profound. They came in, the senator was very willing to see them, and they asked him if he would introduce a resolution on suicide that said basically suicide's a national problem, it warrants a national solution, and we need a national strategy. And that resolution, I'm happy to say, passed unanimously the day it was introduced. So all of a sudden we now had a policy foundation for the United States Congress to address the leading cause of death of suicide.
Now I'd like to note a couple of pieces of that narrative that I think are really outstanding, and I'd like for Bart and Sarah to comment on that. I mean, one is that this had been a cause of death, a leading cause of death for quite some time, and the CDC knew it, and so we had all the data, the public health data, but it was Mike Wallace, a media figure, telling a story effectively, and then another public figure, Harry Reid, and and then Congress saying, oh, we identify and we resonate, and the nation resonating with a story that is well told of people who have lived experience of mental health issues and people who are survivors of suicide, that the narratives were what got the resources to make a national strategy. Bart, what did you react to?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I react to. One, I think we've all sort of recognized over the years that people get motivated by emotion. That no matter how intellectual we get about the problem of suicide, and when we talk about the number of deaths, okay, there's a lot, right? But it's until they can connect it with a person and they can hear that person tell their story is when you really see things gain traction, right? And so when folks was it Senator Reid, I'm assuming, makes this disclosure, that's huge. Now, and what's interesting about this to me is that I had until I heard Jerry tell the story in Kansas City, I had never heard it before, right? So that tells me something else, right? That even though there was this magical moment where this thing happened, it didn't resonate at the level that a lot of other things that should, that when you think about our public fights, they continue to resonate. So we had this moment, but it doesn't seem like we ever gain ongoing traction with suicide. And that's something I think that Jerry and the SPRC have been very, very good about pushing it forward. The other thing, and I'd love to hear Jerry's comment on this, what I find ironic is that this all started around the elderly and suicide,
right? Which
is not a topic that you even hear that much about anymore, even though the rate is phenomenally high.
Yes.
And one of the things I get really frustrated about, and I don't know, so I don't want to sound like a jerk. Okay, every suicide is unacceptable to me. But when there's a teen suicide, people come unglued. They come unglued.
Yeah, I talked with the coroner this week about suicides in his county, and he said 2 14-year-olds. He goes, now if this had been a 70-year-old, at least, I would have had the comfort of knowing. And I was like,
yep. And if you look, and when you look at the numbers of it's older folks who are dying. I mean, for the first time, the 45 to 64 group surpassed the group beyond it, which is a momentous and a wrong way momentum type thing. But why aren't we having more conversations, Jerry, about older folks? Well, it sounds like the youth suicide seems to garner all the attention, and this is a really important issue.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and you're absolutely right. It did start with older adult suicide, and in fact, the first hearing we had after that mental health and the aging hearing, the first hearing that was had was on older adult suicide in the Appropriations Committee, because it is where the highest burden existed. And I think a lot of it has to do with, unfortunately, a lot of times when it comes to older adult health issues, they're almost seen as expected, chronologically expected, whereas a youth suicide is certainly chronologically unexpected, and no suicide is acceptable. I don't mean to suggest that in any way, anything but that would be my opinion. But I think in the beginning it started there, and then in 2005, you may recall, and it gets to the very point that you're talking about, I believe it was 2004, when Senator Gordon Smith lost his son Garrett to suicide. Mm-hmm. And Garrett was a college-age student, and again, there was a personal revelation by an individual who just honestly stood before the American people and his colleagues and said, my son died by suicide. It wasn't something he avoided. He and his wife were very courageous about it, and as we all know, the result of that courage was the passage of the Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act, which is funding, states and territories and tribal communities and campuses to really engage in youth suicide prevention and early intervention. So that story again, and then the survivors of loss coming forward with their stories. I was at CDC just a few weeks ago, and Dr. Tom Frieden, the director of CDC, said something I haven't forgotten since he said it, which was, behind every statistic is a tear. And I just thought, what a beautiful way to explain what 41,149 deaths looks like. There's a ripple effect. There's a family that's been touched, a community that's been touched. And fortunately, when these tragedies occur, we're able to, legislate policy or legislate appropriation. And today, as we sit on this call, every state in the nation has received at least one Garrett Lee Smith Memorial Act. There has never been legislation to fund suicide prevention prior to that happening. So when we feel like the load is heavy sometimes, I think it's worth celebrating that the courage of people like Senator Reid or Pete Domenici, who fought for mental health parity, or Paul Wellstone, or as we're talking about Senator Smith, that kind of courage has made it so much easier for us in the field to do what we're doing because there's a legitimacy. And I've always felt that when a public official speaks and then couples that story with a public policy request, that's when we see advancement happen in the field. No matter whether it's breast cancer, whether it's maybe anxiety, or maybe it's heart disease, when you couple those stories with a policy ask, we tend to see the changes begin to occur. So I agree with both of your assessments.
Behind every statistic is a tear, and when you couple the tears of people who are very visible with policy making, this is when we get the resources we need to do the good that our research and our experts tell us we can do. And I think that's sort of really important for us to sort of remember that's why SPSM talks about media, and we'll ask you about this a little bit down the road, about media and technology and storytelling, because this is just another way to do that even on a bigger scale, because we need the resources really badly.
Right.
Stark, we haven't heard from you, but you have been really busy on the feed, so tell us a little bit about what you're reacting to, because you get to talk to Jerry all the time. This is my first time.
I mean, I'm very lucky. I get to spend all day, every day with Jerry. So I've heard all of his stories multiple times before. But Jerry, as you've talked about public figures speaking publicly about their experiences with mental illness or suicide loss, can you talk a little bit about the impact that the loss survivor community has had on getting policy passed? And then, as a follow-up question, but I'll give it to you now, can you anticipate or talk a little bit about kind of the opportunity we have in the field now with suicide attempt survivors and their voices really being heard for the first time ever in the past few years, with a couple, big reports and activities that have happened?
Great questions, Stark. I never have called you Stark before, but I'm going to call you Stark forevermore. What's most interesting to me is after Senator Reid shared his loss, I honestly got to tell you, the phone started ringing like crazy in the Washington office, people wanting to come in and talk. And there was one couple that in particular called from Marietta, Georgia, who had lost their child to suicide. And they were champion advocates, and they had started a group already in Marietta, Georgia, that was called SPAN USA. And these were a couple that lost their child, and they had begun to engage with survivors all over the country who had lost loved ones as well. And they were going to, as part of their healing, for lack of a better term, we always think of postvention as almost a treatment-oriented experience. But in this case, it was actually advocacy. So they wanted to turn their pain to promise, their hurt to hope, and their grief to action. And the way they thought about doing that, knowing full good and well they couldn't bring back their loved one, but they knew that hundreds of thousands of others around the country who lost their loved one were feeling just like they did, they started a petition campaign. And they were literally no bigger than maybe 1 inch by 5 inches, and people stood out of their faith communities. They stood outside the grocery store. They stood outside the Knights of Columbus or the VFW or the mall, and they would get citizens all over the country to sign a petition saying, we need a national strategy, we need mental health parity, and they put their name and their address, and then this couple would bring them back to their basement. They would organize them by the 535 congressional districts in Congress, and once a year they would have a Hill Day, and people would come to Washington, and we would set up appointments for them to meet their elected officials and carry these petitions into these offices saying it's time to do something about suicide. And I'm so proud of that moment. I had the pleasure of being the executive director of SPAN USA from 2002 to 2007, and I had the privilege of working with people who were loss survivors or attempt survivors and seeing them really trying to change the condition in this country for others, knowing full good and well, like I said, that they couldn't change their own outcome. And that, to me, was just selfless service in the highest regard. And those were well received. The Surgeon General championed suicide prevention. He wrote a call to action. In 2001, he wrote the first national strategy. I could just go on and on and on. But for me as a policy wonk, having a policy foundation was essential. So I don't even hesitate when I'm asked to say, had it not been for the voice of the loss survivor, I don't think we'd be here today having this very conversation. I don't think we would have been gathered in the Midwest for a regional conference. I could go on and on. They lifted the veil of secrecy and gave the nation permission to talk about something that didn't have to be this way. Wow. And so now, to the second part of your question, Sarah, I think that the voice of the attempt survivor, now that we've got the nation's attention that suicide is preventable, there are things we can do and lives can be saved, bringing in the voice of the attempt survivor or those with lived experience are going to tell us from their own experiences what worked and what didn't. How do you really make patient-centered change a reality? How do you construct a transformed system so that the loss or the attempt survivor who's now in a hospital emergency room doesn't feel worse for having come than they already felt for having had to come in the first place? And some of our systems aren't as compassionate and human and thoughtful as they should be, considering the trauma that someone just went through, which led to their having to come in the first place. So I honestly think we are going to transform the delivery of health care in this country, primarily mental health care for people who struggle, by virtue of the voice and the presence of the attempt survivor in an active, authentic way in our field.
Bart, can you react to that while I deal with this dust that's in my eye?
Yeah, it's just one of those things. When we were talking about having Jerry on the show, I was so excited, and to hear these bits of history about these momentous occasions and the efforts of survivors. That even though they couldn't do anything about their own loss, they turned that pain into this energy to galvanize a community and to take that and to go national with it. Just is blowing my mind, right? And it did make me tear up for a bit. I mean, it's just that someone would do that in the face of so much prejudice and discrimination around suicide. I think when we talk about prejudice and discrimination about suicide now in 2015, which I still think is intense, you roll the clock back just 10, 15 years, and it was a completely different ballgame. And so to be able to hear that story and to give honor to those folks and for us to recognize how much we benefited from that movement. And I had heard about SPAN before, but I hadn't heard that detail, and that was really, really, really cool, Jerry.
So yeah. I want to talk about something that happened yesterday to me. So I don't know what you know about. So like Jerry, for me, this is like my first time with Jerry. So some of you on the Twitter feed, you've just been luckier than me, I guess, in life. But Jerry, I work for VA, and I'm a suicide prevention coordinator. And so one of the things that I did yesterday was I spent some time at a Yellow Ribbon for pre-deployment, and I do a little presentation very briefly because if you set up the suicide table, it's the table that's too awkward for people to visit. And so I have some ways that I sort of overcome that. And I give a very direct and engaging and sort of brief but intense presentation on suicide prevention and gun safety, because a lot of my soldiers and veterans who die by suicide via gunshot wound. And getting soldiers to be interested in taking every gun lock I have without me forcing it on them is sort of my goal, which did happen. But during the presentation, a woman got up and walked out of the back, which made me a little concerned. And I was going to go look for her, but she found me pretty quickly. And she says to me, you know, I'm here with my son who's about ready to deploy, but we just lost his brother to suicide. And she lives in Houston, not even a year ago. And she said, I'm an ER nurse, and so I know that this is a real problem, but I don't know what to do about it. And I decided very shortly following my son's death that I want to make it my mission to understand why people die by suicide and do something about it. And she said, do you know who I should talk? And I was like, do I know who you should talk to? Lady, let me tell you. And so we're gonna follow up tomorrow to help her. But that's also part of the issue, that when somebody dies by suicide, many people want to know why and what to do, and often not everybody figures out how to do, doesn't know the story of lobbying for a national strategy. But the truth is, if we could figure out how to make those stories bigger, there are sadly every day hundreds of people who suddenly are asking that question and who are asking for something to do. It would be good if we had something for them to do.
Oh, I think that's incredibly important. And so I often believe and say that, you know, suicide prevention really happens in the community. It's not happening in Washington. Sarah was mentioning earlier that, you know, everything doesn't happen in Washington, although I think some good things can and should happen in Washington, and I think it's a matter of knowing what is our piece of the puzzle in Washington and what is the piece of the puzzle in the community. But I think, you know, it could be very helpful for people just to connect with their American Foundation for Suicide Prevention chapter if one happens to exist in their community. If you care deeply about a veteran, connect with the suicide prevention coordinator at the VA, one of 350, I believe. If you have nothing else that, you know what to do, talk to your faith community. See what kind of ministries exist in your faith community for people who struggle with mental health. When somebody might drop out of the choir, or their wife passes away if it's an older gentleman and he stops coming to church. If it's all about protective factors and connectedness, there is something. You don't have to come up with a theory of suicide like Thomas Joyner did. While that's a great contribution, your contribution could be as simple as looking at a homeless person in the eye and say, how are you today? Because you may be the only person that takes the time to acknowledge his or her existence on a given day. I don't think we should we should stop ourselves by the magnitude of our contribution. I think we should just legitimize whatever we do to care about another human being is a gift that it's priceless. And you may be the one gift that person receives on the day they were thinking of ending their life. So I would just say don't minimize it, and find a way that's comfortable and congruent for you to contribute to the greater good of trying to save lives. I think for me it's the way to move forward. I've often said, and I think Bart, you and Tony heard me when I was in the Midwest, and certainly Sarah has heard me say it many, many times. I just think knowledge, compassion, and courage are three ingredients that really matter in suicide prevention. And I also think, to your question about what we can do, I really do think the more I'm in this field now 20 years, the more I think we should refrain from thinking there's any single solution. I think every population has a different set of risks, and what works for one population may not work for another population. And if we're really going to be effective in suicide prevention, for me, one of the greatest discoveries in the last 20 years is we are now looking at mental health and public health as sisters and brothers, because I really think no one approach is going to solve suicide. What works for an older 75-year-old man may not work for a 16-year-old LGBTQ individual, and we just can't think of this as though there's a single solution. And I can tell you that SPRC is really beginning to look at how to help our stakeholders, and that's all of us, think a little differently about how we might approach a comprehensive approach and not look at the best practices registry and say, oh, I want that one, because one and done is not the answer. It's comprehensive, and learning to think comprehensively about what brings that risk to a given population and what do we have available that might reduce that risk if applied, in a way that has fidelity associated with it.
I'm going to check in with our moderators. You've just unpacked quite a lot. Bart, what are you reacting to?
So there's so much. I mean, there's a couple of things that really resonate with me, and one of them that is suicide is a community public health problem. And I think one of the things that I have really struggled with, and it's one of the reasons that I struggle with this bill that's going before Congress right now, and I can't think of the gentleman's name that's putting it forward, but it's very focused on psychiatry, right, and the medical model as opposed to community efforts. And that's one of the things that when I talk to people who really understand suicide prevention, like Jerry and the folks at Living Works and David Covington, they really talk about community and peers, and everybody has a role, and that we can't have this all be run through the medical community. And so that every one of us can help. And the thing that really resonated is, as today we had one of our own members who was just minding their own business on Facebook this morning and ended up on a 4 or 5 hour suicide intervention via Facebook, right? I think it went even longer than 5 hours. And so this is the sort of thing that one person made a huge difference in somebody's life, and it happened via social media, one. And two, that person, even though they had other things they needed to do with their life today, they stopped what they were doing and they tried and connected with somebody that was at risk of suicide. And that's really what Jerry's talking about, these individual efforts that if we did them, nationwide, if we could just get a lot more folks doing this sort of thing, what a huge impact that would have. So he's singing my song, and I'm just soaking it up. How's this hitting you, April?
I'm really trying to see if I can get people to meme. Like, there are a lot of really good sort of bits in this, and I'm trying to get people to meme them in ways I can get people to share. I think I was listening really to about knowledge, compassion, and courage. I think that was the thing that I really reacted to, because I don't know what everybody else needs to do this work. I know I only can speak for myself, although usually I'll speak for anyone if you give me 2 seconds. But the ability to be very bold when it's necessary, even when it's not comfortable, because I don't feel like when we do the things that are comfortable necessarily this works very well. But you also must know just a tremendous amount, and you must really convince people that you know what you're talking about. And you must, at a very, very fundamental level, be able to understand emotionally things that are really not, I think, your first gut instinct to understand. And so, at least maybe at least not for me. So for me, I've been most effective when I say, I can really understand how someone might get to in this moment. Or I think we were talking earlier about an interaction, and Bart even referenced this, where someone is talking about being in crisis and the police have come to their door, and the police are frustrated, this person is frustrated. I talk a lot and I advocate a lot for people with borderline personality disorder, and I can't say that was what was going on, but you have to sort of have compassion for what it's like to have that disorder, for what it's like to be the underpaid law enforcement officer who's become the front line of mental health suddenly because of bad national policy, for things that are said that make you really not like, ooh, that's not, what Jerry's talking about, not a compassionate system, and we need a compassionate system. And all of that's really difficult to do, right? So you have to come at it with this force. And so I think of knowledge and compassion, and I think of courage, that ability to say something really in a smart, evident, human way. Like, that's the thing that I think drives getting people to do the things that work.
Yeah, I find most people, and Sarah, I'll give it to you, but I find most people certainly want to do the right thing. Sometimes they don't know the right thing. And so I think the more that they can just fall back in that, what do you know? How can you be compassionate in whatever you deliver? And sometimes it can just be the offer to put your head on my shoulder and cry. We don't need to talk. I don't need to have an answer. But just know that I care about you no matter where you are right now. And then the courage. I mean, I've had people in my life call me. We all talk about safety plans, but we never really talk much about what to do if you're on someone's safety plan. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I think it's a really important point, because when I see a certain phone number, no matter what I'm doing, I'm going to excuse myself from the room because I know what that means. Right. And I think that kind of, capacity is essential if we're really going to use the tool of a safety plan to be a lifesaver for somebody who's in a difficult space. So I would just say that I think those work for me, and I have to say I think the two questions that I always loved from Schneidman, that if you don't know what else to do, I'm not a clinician, so I don't want to claim to be more than I am capable of being, but I just thought the questions, tell me where you hurt and tell me what I can do, are such simple questions that I could ask my child. Just tell me where you hurt and tell me what you need me to do, rather than coming in as though I have all these answers, because many of us don't. And sometimes that's just a gift to somebody to respond, I think.
Hey, I am a clinician, and I do not have all the answers, and what I say is we're going to try some things, and it may or may not work, but I'm going to be here if it works, and I'll be here if it doesn't, and then we'll try something else because I care about what happens to you. I find it's not, they don't need you to have the answer, they just want to know you're not quitting them.
Yep, you're going to be there.
Yeah. Dark, sorry, we're running all over this train.
Oh, no, I just want to jump in and talk about what's happening on the live feed. Twirl and Swirl, I'm sorry, Jerry Reed is happily married, so even though you love what he's saying, he is taken.
Wait a minute, Twirl and Swirl is married. Okay.
Jonathan Singer at Social Work Podcast, you're right. It is very difficult to moderate Jerry, April, and Bart, and it is very difficult to comment on what Jerry says. And there was one other comment. Chris Maxwell says, absolutely loving how touched and speechless Jerry Reed is making Bart and April. Bart and April are not often speechless. But one thing I wanted to bring up, aside from what's happening on the feed, is I've known Jerry for a few years now, and if you can't tell, he is very humble. So I'm going to do a little brag for Jerry and let him talk about it. But some of you may or may not know that Jerry Reed co-wrote the revised National Strategy for Suicide Prevention. So Jerry, I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about that and the responses you've received since writing that document with the Surgeon General.
Well, thanks, Sarah, and I appreciate your mentioning that work. It was almost, in fact, it probably was as hard as my dissertation, to be honest with you, because it was, it was the first demand, for lack of a better term, or request, I should say, from the Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention, the public-private partnership that was formed in 2010. They asked for a revised national strategy to incorporate all of the new knowledge. And I think the thing I'm most proud about is that we wanted to write the national strategy in a way that spoke to the American people, and it wasn't full of chi-squared and p-values and significance at this level, blah blah blah. While all that's really important, and I want all my professors in my PhD program to know I did listen, I did learn, and I do respect all of that, I wanted the national strategy to really speak more to the American people. And the way it was written in in 4 strategic directions. And quite simply, the first one is to build healthy families, individuals, and communities. So very, very upstream. Let's just make the world a kinder and better place for a whole lot of reasons and care about each other. The second strategic direction was to build strategic prevention prepared communities. So if you were in a VA, or if you were in a faith community, or if you were in a community behavioral mental health center, you would be prepared to recognize risk when it walked through your door. The third strategic direction was just to make available to the those that were touched with a challenge in mental health, that if they touched a mental health system, it was going to be the right door and they were going to know what to do with them. And so the objectives under that direction are very focused on, let's use evidence-based practices, let's make sure that we embed suicide prevention into our healthcare system so it's not an afterthought but a forethought, and the whole system is transformed to make sure we screen and assess. Our clinicians are caring and competent and well trained. We ask about the availability of lethal means for a patient at risk, and we make sure that once they leave our system, they're connected to another system, so that we have a pathway for people to know that we care and that we're going to care with them, as you said, April, until they're well. And it's not going to be just because I didn't have the right answer at that moment. We'll find the right answer because you matter to me and to us, to come back to your full prosperous self. And then the final strategic direction was just making sure we use data, we evaluate what we do, and we invest in research, because I do believe one of the biggest challenges in suicide prevention in the U.S. today is that our investment in research is woefully inadequate. And if we're ever going to make sure that every door is the right door and every clinician is trained, and no matter where you live in this country, when you walk into a behavioral health facility or a healthcare facility, they're going to know what to do with you just as well as if you walk in with a heart attack. They sure know what to do with the heart attack victim, but they're not, I don't think, as comfortable treating the patient who walks in with a psychiatric or mental health crisis, and we can't stop until we're there. But I do appreciate it.
Yeah, before I did the suicide prevention coordinator job, I had training in CPR every year, every year since I was 12. I've been continuously certified in CPR. Never met anybody with chest pain, having a heart attack. Talk with people who are suicidal, even long before I went to graduate school. People talk to you. That's how you end up being a shrink. And remarkably, no one ever trained me what to do, and there was never any certification. And we're going to talk about research dollars, and we're going to talk about system change here in just a minute.
Great.
We are rounding the corner. I can't believe it's sort of our last topic before we do final thoughts. Sarah, can you do a check-in on the feed before I redirect to the future and technology?
The feed looks good. The feed looks like a lot of quotable moments here. I don't see a whole lot of questions coming in, which is fine, but I see lots of people tweeting out links to the national strategy and tweeting out various resources that are relevant to the conversation.
And if people want to get the national strategy, Sarah, can you just briefly say where people can find all this stuff on SPRC real quick?
Well, yes. If you go to the SPRC website, sprc.org, and search for National Strategy, you'll find it there. You can also visit the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention website, and it's up there too. And if that's not enough, it's on the Surgeon General's website also, National Strategy for Suicide Prevention.
And I believe you're taking Fangirl for Jerry Reed membership dues?
Yes. If you'd like to send me your membership dues, I'm happy to take them. We have not decided how much membership dues yet will be, but throughout the night they might increase, so you want to get in early. Jerry, we're going to be talking a little bit about the future. You have the mile-high view. I mean, quite literally, you're one of those uniquely seated people. One of the things that we talk about a lot here are the ways that we think that media and technology could be absolute game changers in taking suicide and getting it off of that top 10 cause of death list and dropping its impact in our society. This is a personal conviction of mine, but I'm very willing to hear your thoughts on what you think the impact's going to be and where policy needs to go to be ready for that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and as I said originally, I'm not the most versed in social media. When I left Europe, I think in 1988, I remember truly after getting my children safely on the plane, the next thing I said was, I've got to get literate with computers, or else I will be left behind in the world. They were just coming online in 1988. So I think for me, the value of social media, from what I've seen in the future of what social media can do, it will engage people that heretofore we have not engaged. I think we can reach much broader audiences, and I think the social media community knows how to communicate in very layman-friendly terms, which I think will make this a bit more of a forbidden topic. It'll relate with people, and if it's coupled with a resource or a product or 1-800-273-TALK, where people who might struggle can get help once they read a post like this, I think it's great. I think it'll create new norms. I often use the Institute of Medicine ARCH framework: promotion, prevention, treatment, postvention, or aftercare. And I think when I thought about this afternoon when I took my walk, I can really see applications for health promotion, for prevention of suicide. If you're in treatment, how to maybe communicate with your practitioner or your provider in ways that are mutually understandable to both of you as to your well-being. And that can be very reassuring to both you and the clinician to know you're on the same page. And I think the apps are great. I think postvention, people lose loved ones all over the country, and unfortunately there are not suicide support groups all over the country where they might be needed. So I know of a woman who's been running an online support group for 15 years, and it's been life-saving to survivors in rural America who've been able to connect with her group just because, they can. And so I'm really a champion of seeing this technology go forward. My only apprehension, as I said in the very beginning, is the same apprehension I think we all have in the work we do, is to do no harm. So always make sure there's a referral for 1-800-273-TALK, or always make sure you give a resource so that someone can learn more on their own about this material. And I think the other area that has huge promise is telemedicine. I really think that the mental health community, behavioral health community, can lend itself very nicely to serving people in rural America who may not have the access to behavioral health providers that others do. So I think it has a huge promise, and I'm just at the age of 61, so I just turned that, so I can honestly say that I think the days of having to go to the doctor's office all the time for your care are beginning to transform to a way where you don't have to. There's going to be ways to have a strong, solid clinical relationship with your provider, different than what we know it, because I do think the world is changing. So I'm big with
totally there with you on that, because think about how apps could be collecting data about your day-to-day mental health functioning, your mood, your risk, whatever, and pushing that right to your doctor, and then your doctor just being able to take 10 minutes and check in with you face-to-face by video. And what amazes me is that because I have the telemed equipment at the VA, and it's secure and encrypted, but the truth is that the technology on this can be made secure and can be made to connect with the medical record. And there are a lot of problems and challenges to solve, which is, once we start interacting with this, how do we put it in the medical record in a meaningful way? And there are ways to solve those challenges. But you are right. I do a lot, because of the nature of my job being flexible. I'm not held to a traditional clinic. I do a lot of 10-minute check-ins with people by phone, all day. I find, and these are folks high risk for suicide, borderline personality disorder, getting very structured coaching, and they get high-touch, high-frequency contact sort of in unscheduled ways. It works very well, but you would have to really run clinics and billing a lot differently for it to be sustained outside of VA.
Yeah, and I would just say, that if if its outcome is lives saved and healthier individuals, then let's challenge the status quo, whatever's the barrier to get there, and do it. And I think that's pretty much where I am after 20 years in the field. It should be quite appropriate for us to challenge the status quo, provided we always think of safety, always thinking of doing them no harm, trying to reach people in ways that they're accustomed to being reached. And if it saves lives, then we've done the right thing.
Yeah, I get a lot of patients who want me to text them information so that they can save it on their phone, and because it's not secure, I can't. And I could, like, there are ways that you could make that okay. It's just not set up as part of our process, and so it's always, speaking of which, we have a question from Jonathan Singer. You need to shout out to Jonathan Singer because he's a little bit in love with you. Also, they're asking if there are student rates for joining your fan club, if you will accept memes and provocative pictures. And Dr. Mike Sevilla wants to join as well. He's the king of family medicine and social media, so he's saying shout out. But Jonathan Singer, who's a social worker, says, are there any ways that national policy might actually be interfering with suicide prevention that you could think of?
Well, I think when we're limited in our thinking, I mean, sometimes, having worked on the Hill for a couple years, sometimes the approach is to solve a problem. And if you don't engage the right people or the right organizations who understand the issue comprehensively, then the solution you create might not be comprehensive, and it might not really be, it might have unanticipated consequences, I guess, is what I'm saying. So when I worked there, one of the things that struck me, and I was so pleased, we had the American Foundation, the American Association of Suicidology, SAVE, NAMI, the American Psychological Association. We never created a policy that didn't have very broad support of the NGO sector or the guild sector, who theoretically spends their days on this issue. So I think the response I would give is how possible it would be to create a policy that, although it may be very well intended, may not really address the concern that you're trying to address in the first place. And that would be my greatest concern, is that we celebrate, oh boy, we've got another mental health policy, but it may not be the right mental health policy. So one of the things I was thinking about today is that American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, in our field of suicide prevention, is the organization that has the public policy apparatus. They have a public policy agenda, they have a Hill Day, and my dream would be that not just the AFSP chapter staff, but all of us in the field of suicide prevention would connect with AFSP, help them articulate the public policy needs, the true public policy needs, not that what they do isn't true, but really the comprehensive list, and then all of us go with them on Hill Day to visit our elected representatives, if we're permitted to do so, to carry that agenda. I don't think one agency should be left to carry that all by themselves. I think clinicians, researchers, policymakers that are able to, etc., academicians, all of us should go up there and try to say to our elected officials, it's time, let's do the job, get this off the top 10 list of deaths, and save a lot of lives, which is the other good thing about our field, is we're beginning to quantify how many lives should be saved. AFSP hopes to reduce the crude rate by 20% by 2025. The National Action Alliance hopes to save 20,000 lives over 5 years, and the World Health Organization hopes to reduce suicide by 10% around the world by 2020. Those goals suggest that we should be looking at the most promising interventions in the most at-risk populations and go at it full steam ahead to save the lives that we're capable of saving. So we got to do that together.
Yes, I'm a daughter of many generations of rural America. Thank you. Like, I practiced in rural America. I cannot say enough how much they need the resources. Not that everybody does and everyone does, but thank you. This is our last couple of minutes. We just have a minute or two before final thoughts. I'm going to check in with Bart. This feed is amazing.
Yeah, just Jerry, just watching the feed, your message is resonating so deeply with folks. And I expected this, but it's just really cool to see it happen. I think one of the things as we're talking, one of the things that always just makes me a little crazy is the irony that the group that's dying at the highest rate of suicide is a group that lives in areas that is predominantly very against public health measures and supporting more care and subsidizing care. And it's very frustrating because these folks are dying, right? And we're not doing a good enough job in getting resources to folks. Dr. Jonathan Singer, who's amazing, found an article about this intense self-reliance, right? That in fact, we as we progress as a nation, we become so focused on the individual and individual success, and that gets pushed and pushed and pushed at such a high level that we stop taking care of each other. And when somebody is struggling, particularly in these areas, to reach out and say, I need help, would be viewed in their community, or they think it would be viewed as a sign of weakness, right? And so this idea that we really need to get back to grassroots community efforts, and people need to look out for each other and care for each other. And I think one of the things that I think is so wise, and seeing the Zero Suicide effort unfold, that there is no silver bullet. There's lots of things that we need to be doing, and lots of folks need to be involved. And what we've all done, myself included, and many people sitting here, we've all sat and waited for AFSP to do something, or AAS to do something, or National Council on Behavioral Health to do something. And we all need to be involved at this, both at the front line and at the legislative end. And I think that message that, we're doing good things, but we need to be thinking both, and Sean Stark on Social Media, we need to be thinking both the micro and the macro level on these efforts. And I think you do such a nice job of tying the micro efforts and the macro efforts together, and it was just really cool to see. That's why I've been so quiet. I've just been sucking this all up.
Yeah, people have been too absorbed in what you're saying to even make dirty jokes, which is pretty impressive for us.
Darn, I missed it.
Oh, come back next week. We'll be plenty filthy. Sarah, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm just glad this went well. You know, when you bring your boss in to like give a speech somewhere and it doesn't go well, you hear about it the next day. So hopefully tomorrow morning, Jerry recognizes how well this went and everyone was very engaged. Of course, my final note is promotional. Learn more about the Suicide Prevention Resource Center at sprc.org. Visit the National Action Alliance for Suicide Prevention at actionallianceforsuicideprevention.org, and learn more about Zero Suicide in Health and Behavioral Health Care at zerosuicide.sprc.org.
Ooh, there's one thing that happened this evening, and this was huge. We don't want to pass this up. On SPSM Live, Sarah Burns' boss referred to her as Stark, recorded, it was tweeted out, and given that Sarah was so reluctant to let people know about her alter ego, the Starkness, that here and now, it is real, it is live, it is huge.
I don't know if you guys saw one of Twirl and Swirl's comments. Laurel came. Jerry, you don't know Laurel. She's one of our sort of social media sort of band of merry mischief makers, and she came to AAS on the social media team and found out who Marsha Linehan was. Like she didn't really know, and then of course gets to see her speak live in the front rows and tweet her, and she says, let me see if I can get the tweet for tonight. On a scale of 1 to Marsha Linehan, where do we rate Jerry Reed?
That's huge. That's huge.
That's huge. I think she called Marsha Linehan her spirit animal, so good job, Jerry.
Well, listen, this was a real joy for me. I was a little into anxiety, I must admit. I had a little anxiety about this, so I took a long walk today. But it was harmless. You guys are great. I will leave you with what I often say. In our field, we should fly in formation and not fly solo. So let's really try to always fly together, because we're gonna solve this issue when we're working together, micro to macro, public health to mental health, individual to society, and no other way. So count me as an ally in the fight. And for those of you I don't know, I'm at jreed@edc.org. I'd be happy to chat with any of you. I now consider you part of the new circle, so my new circle. So thank you. Love you too.
Formation. That is a great final thought. Let's check in with Stark. Final thoughts from Sarah Stark.
Jerry just made the heart symbol with his hand. So
that's
I
big,
think that's
right,
it.
Sarah? That's big.
I mean, like. That's it. I don't have anything else. A heart symbol with his
I
name.
told you, he's a natural. He's like made for this medium. Bart Andrews, final thoughts.
Yeah, I agree, Jerry. You translate so well on the show, and I think the reason that is because you not only talk the talk, you walk the walk. You are so genuine, and that genuineness just really comes through when you're talking. And when you combine, just like you said it, when you combine knowledge and compassion with courage, like you've done, amazing things happen. And I guarantee you that people are going to be talking about this conversation. I'm going to share this conversation on this YouTube with my staff because it was amazing. Just the history alone is something we all need to know about, but there are so many pearls of wisdom that got strung together tonight. Just amazing.
Thanks.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. We are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Jerry Reed, for joining us. This is where we do the normal outro. We are really grateful for the hour that you spent with us. I feel like we had sort of sort of an historic and sort of classic moment. You know, at SPSM, we've had a wonderful way of sort of linking what's happened in the past works, where we have Mike Wallace talking about his lived experience of depression in front of Congress, and we have the Jerry and Harry Reeds who are making Congress really pay attention to the issue. And then bringing him, you know, he goes from that moment all the way sort of fast forward to here he is streaming live on the interwebs, telling us about where he thinks the future is, and that the future is where the past was, just with different mediums, where it's about knowledge, it's about compassion, and it's about courage. If you can please have some knowledge, compassion, and courage this week, share this stream. This is a wonderful way for you to learn more about the field of suicide prevention, and I think if you if you have a day where you're like, can I do this? Can I wake up and do this tomorrow? I think watching this video is going to be the thing that helps you get through it. Thank you so much. Everybody go to Spark. Check them out. They're fabulous. And I think we're technically on there soon or something, right, Sarah? Something happened with the SPSM material I found out. Linda, tweet it out, because Linda Langford tells me, and I was totally blown away a couple weeks ago. Thank you so much for trusting us and joining us every week. Next week, we're going to be talking about journalism and working better with journalists, and then we will have a little bit of a week off for Thanksgiving. So everybody have a great Monday. Take care.
Yes, thanks again.
Bye.
Good night.